Hello. Today I would like to work on counting loud voice when practicing. It's not just wish with little hopes of accomplishment by a teacher, because it's sort of not really fun to practice with that by yourself since you don't have a conductor. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3. So you count the 30 seconds in a subdivision of a slow movement like in the Tempest in Beethoven's 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 6, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, This kind of counting subdivides so much slow movements that, of course, while doing that, you lose the phrasing direction. My students to play the slow tempo movements which have to be subdivided to be counted in precision, while they have to have a direction of the line, obviously. Therefore, practice the adagio, the andante, as an allegro or perhaps even more faster, a lively tempo, so that you can foreseeably see the arrival point. And then extend it, stretch it, as it is written, stretched by slow tempo, with quite fast meter indication, therefore with a lot of 16th and 30 seconds. And you can think 2, 3, 1, and start counting loud voice singing to accompany the melodic legato of the patterns. 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. But then you follow your fingers. You need to conduct your fingers. Of course, it would be nice if you could give yourself an upbeat, which should be equal to the downbeat. Orchestra musicians are more trained for that. Solo pianists, solo practicing pianists, obviously, solo lonely pianists have to impose that to themselves. In the Schumann concerto, there is a finale where, of course, most of the section is purposely in hemiola, one beat together every 2 bars. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, the pianist doesn't count, since there is no other musicians to cue start and connect and breathe with and sort of adapt to their exhale, inhale, regular breathing, as well as the pulse rhythm pattern of meter counting. It's metronomic as well as physiologic. And I find that, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1. And then the middle section legato, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or the other section in the middle, and 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Always count staccato, always. Impose it to yourself, regardless if you sing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. In slower tempi, obviously conductors subdivide because they have to organize the unison of 16 violins playing together at a 32nd, but when you play it by yourself, you don't need to. Meanwhile, how do you keep the pace, the tempo, besides practicing it with the metronome? which Melzel in the late 20s in Vienna marketed, and Beethoven barely discovered a year before his death, is an objective point of view about the tempo that you want to leave as a mark before you could record the playing of the piece, obviously, in his time. And so if you do a tempo like the Tempest first movement, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, the staccato counting corresponds 2, 3, 4 to the mood. But if you play the opening of it, 1, and you go 2, 3, 4, 1, in fact, you don't count anything, you just sort of accompany with words and numbers the beats when they correspond. And because it's so slow, you have to subdivide 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, and then 8. You can even add the exact amount of beats in the practicing for the fermata, which is supposed to be the double. It doesn't have to be exactly that. Of course, it's mostly the time not exactly the double or the third extra. And people do it just by feeling. Today I feel. But let's say the fermata apart, the flagrant conducting, self-conducting, is in sections that are very rhythmical as well as very busy rhythmically and technically. For instance, when you have repeated notes and you have a left hand that is motoric, you almost feel like you don't need to count because you play many notes fast, therefore. But except that we have repeated notes. Sometimes they don't repeat, sometimes they repeat too early, and very often pianists start what I call leaning forward. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, or some things more interestingly is to do with the counting when you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, Legato pianissimo, you count staccato, but you still think of the direction of the line, as I said earlier, in a faster tempo. Okay, you want to get to the dominant. Now you can go to the dominant, but with the length of the beats as indicated by Beethoven and the tempo, and then for count the subdivision in order to make sure that the short note is not a grace note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1. When you have something like dotted rhythm in the meter indication, but mostly in the style, like Siciliana, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. Usually 3 and 6 go to, of course, 4 and 1 in eighth notes, but very often 2 and 5 are the notes which don't usually play and are usually held. For instance, in the Barcarolle by Chopin, 2, 5, or even in the ballade, 2, 5, 2, 5, 2, 5, 2, 5, 2, instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you only name the beat that is the stretch which you don't play. Almost like in a syncopation, even in a hemiola. 1, 2, 1, 2, like in the Schumann concerto. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and not 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. If you can do the hemiola counting, then you maintain the pace because you count in larger steps. But if you follow all the beats that you play, then you follow like the dog's leash. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 3. And by the time the arm gets a little bit stiff, then you start rushing because you don't control. But if you count independently of your playing, be it staccato, legato, hemiola, syncopation, or Siciliana with 6/8, it's always good to pulse count here inside yourself, loud voice when you practice, obviously silently when you perform in front of people, but count inside to make sure that you keep that pace. That doesn't mean that you'll be so rigid. Obviously, nobody's even able to put a metronome on any YouTube recording or performance that is recorded, where it appears that the pianist keeps the tempo, but sometimes the fluctuations are made so that this nano rubato steals a beat here and turns a beat there, and you feel like the structure is holding without to be rigid. A bit like what they build for the structures of, or the constructions of buildings where there is a lot of earthquakes, so that it can take a certain shaking and still hold. Which is what I think for a building analogy is the analogy for the rubato, because obviously you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. The grace note delays the beat, 2, 3, then the fourth beat is 2 against 3, 4, 1. So you would take it longer, 2, then 3 you would rush, and then 4 you would still delay, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so the swaying of the around the beat is to do with that rubato, which avoids to sound stiff, while if indulged, it becomes a zigzag that has no end. And so you feel like, yes, it's more expressive at certain levels, like you can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Chromatic scale. I should have practiced it before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 1. You can always subdivide to secure that you don't rush that scale after I practiced it. But that is because counting is therapeutical. First, it establishes in your cognitive memory the tempo, because the cognitive memory, often the gestural memory, is to do with our spacing with the hand gesture instead of counting. If you do the Carnival by Schumann and do 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, with the hemiola, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, or 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the bar structures, or is the hemiola inside, or it's every beat. But the point of the story is that very often when we play the piano, we gesturize our shiftings or our spacings in order to keep the tempo while not counting. So the gesture becomes our sort of choreographic metronome, for better word, or lack of better word rather. And if you do 1 and you do this, semicircle landing between bass and chord represents in the space the tempo of the metronome. But if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, Of course, that is not artistically or musically appealing, but practicingly it is. Because if you delegate it only to the metronome, the old-fashioned style with the pendulum or the flashing style electronically, you follow the crotchet, but you don't feel like you walk yourself. So you try to make sure that this section and that section fit. For instance, in the last movement of the last Schubert sonata, the flow of this kind of dance, which it is, the swing almost in modern days, makes you go forward more than slow down. And so if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, then you of course regulate it. When you play something more slow that has more space between the notes, you want to make sure that that is the moment to really count and oblige yourself to follow it while musically create a melodic direction or a sentence storytelling, agogic direction where you want to bring your listener to. Let's say the scherzo 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. In the trio section of the scherzo of the Schubert's Last Sonata is Chemiola in minor 1, 2, 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. Mozart Sonata in C minor finale 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Now you can calculate the group of bars bar a beat so that since there is no music in the melody playing on the downbeat, you can group it therefore for the direction of the line by counting forcefully 4 or 8 bars beats, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you add inside the quarter notes, becomes 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 6, 2, 3, 7, 2, 3, 8, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 5, 2, 3, 6, 2, 3, 7, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Obviously, it's not easy when you practice, because when you play with busier notes or practice busier notes, you don't count as easily as when you play less notes. But that is a good preparation for chamber music, for concerto practicing, where you have to play all the expression while remaining metronomically precise in order to be together with the orchestra. Here you're only together with yourself. In the Schumann Carnival you have Pantalon and Colombier. In order to avoid rushing, you have to count. 1, 2, and 3, and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you feel, sorry for the E flat, the offbeat 2, 3, 4. In the Paganini movement of it, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. When you count and you play in syncopation, offbeat constantly, like in Schumann very often, if you don't count the downbeat, you don't follow the syncopation, you give it a real blossoming of the offbeat, and not some kind of rush to catch up with the downbeat that is always displaced. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And many times the pianist end up counting on the beat the offbeat of it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. They go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you self-indulge, singing, counting on the beats, no matter where they are, even displaced. But if you count them independently from the structure of which is written, then you are counting the syncopation and you're playing it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. These kind of signs are very important to keep in mind, because counting should be also connected to inhaling and exhaling when you practice and you play. You don't always, often students hold their breath while it's a difficult section, and then they release it in an awkward time in the piece. In fact, you should most time intake air before you start a section, a piece, a phrase, and slowly exhale it in order to even physiologically, musically create the sense of breathing of the phrase, of the storytelling. storytelling is very important to me. I think possibly the most important, because okay, the grammar of music is harmony and contrapoint. The pace of music, the structure, the energy is in the rhythmic pulse and the meter chosen to represent it. So you have the motion and the emotion together. And then you have the combination. And the combination is not to sound by bar lines for the audience, because then it feels like very rigid, but to count and constantly rebounce yourself on the downbeat in order to be not heavy on it. I often mention to students not to play downbeat with low wrist, because that even enhances that sense of settling down. Whenever the first beat should always bring the next beat, next beat, like when you step and you walk, or when you run. So there has to be always a gesture that goes forward until the last note. Some composers finish on an upbeat, like Bach in a G major fugue, and other composers, him included, sometimes finish with a downbeat. So we feel like we've started upbeat, like Beethoven, 1, 2, 3, but we finish on 1. But we start off the beat to finish on 1. In Russian music or Slavic music, very often it starts on 1 as a pulse. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or the Rachmaninoff concerto. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you want to go further in the happy meter. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. So you can play arpeggios, you can play just the melody to organize it, but it's always starting on the downbeat, or most of the time, which gives a sense of gravitas, of heaviness, of deep rooted downbeat. And that is, the departure is on 1, instead of most of the music of the Western culture between Bach and Ravel starts on the upbeat. And that gives you a sense of jump start. And this is your downbeat, even if it's an up note. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. And then in 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. Sometimes you can amuse yourself to count it in a different group of beats of the bar line, just to ignore the downbeatishness that comes intuitively and sometimes unwillingly most of the time when I say to students, you play accents on the beats. And you try to avoid it by always feeling that there is a re-articulation of the second of the 4/16 notes. Versus I purposely accent them because I'm devil's advocate now to prove my point. But even if you don't accent, after several group of bars, you end up by hearing that pulse on the downbeat, which you don't impose as an accent, but in the repetitivity it becomes sort of the obsessive beat. And so you hear one, or you hear 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. So you only play from the second 16th note, then you roll to the next first, and it's 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, or 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4 in eighth notes, 2, 3, 4 in quarter notes, 2, 3, 4 in eighth notes, 2, 3, and 16 notes, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4. But you feel like 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4 are your impulse and always rebounds down beats which bring you to the next beat. It sort of creates a sort of perpetual motion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. Very times the music itself drives you so much, like in the Goldberg variation. Some play slow. And that is not here a question in this conversation, rather monologue of mine, obviously, but conversation with you at large, is that the pace can connect to the mood. So does the major, the minor, the articulation, the kind of texture that you think the music brings through for the character that it's supposed to evoke. And so, of course, you can play. And let's say you play 1 bar a beat or 3 beats a bar. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And if it's faster, you can count 1 bar a beat. 1, that's 2 bars. 1, 2, 1, 2. So in the 6/8 and the 3/4, you can have 6/8 on 3/4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So beyond the tempo choice of the taste, the tradition, the whatever you like to choose it. But once you have a tempo, then you have to keep it. And here the purpose of this talk is about keeping it through counting. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This is with the right hand pattern of 3 times 2. 1 and 2, 3, like 3, 1 and 2 and 3 and, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1 and 2, 3, 4, 1, 2 and 3. And so you can feel 3 beats. Left hand is 1, 2, 1, 2. Dividing the 6/8 notes in 2 times 3. 1, 2, 1, 2. So if you count the 6/8 on the 3/4 is 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. If you count to the 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But the two have independent pulse. Now Bach didn't indicate accents that are supposed to be purposely layered or overimposed on each other in order to create this kind of syncopation feeling. Beethoven does that more often, but Bach probably just wrote it and let us playfully play the pulse ping pong. If not, the 2 hands become then either in 3/4 or in 6/8 and is verticalized playing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 instead of 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. When it's dancey, it's like in Albanese, it's about alternating 3, 4 and 6/8. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And he indicates it even on the score with a change of meter, literally by bar, because it has this perpetual alternation of the two. But in Bach, it's superimposed or hinted so. It doesn't say per se that you have to sort of playfully. If you accentuate too much the difference, you'll hear. And it sounds like, why am I getting this kind of accents that sort of put me off balance? I want to hear one and the other one follows as an accompaniment. Or not. In a way, it doesn't matter really which one you choose to count, as long as you keep counting, because then you can organize your structure and you can be the architect of your playing or the conductor of your own orchestra. And it's difficult to take it in account when you play a difficult section in terms of technique, because as soon as it becomes difficult, stop breathing, stop counting, just following the fingers to make sure they all sort of by cognitive memory, finger memory play, which is, yeah, I mean, it's not wrong. It's just not necessarily the only solution, because then you are prone to not keep the tempo, because you only follow your fingers, like in the Mussorgsky pictures in Limoges. So little by little the arm gets stiffer, the repeated notes less repeated, and by the middle of the piece, the the first slurs of 4 become a sliding forward. They have to be that excitement that the Limoges farmers market is supposed to represent, like the crowd and the mayhem musically, but not rhythmically. It's written in very equal, well, notated in equal bars, not uneven rhythms. So you have to make sure that if you count 1, 2, 3, you can also play on the downbeats as you play on all the beats. It's 16th notes that are everywhere. Ta, 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 ta. And if you count only the off beats, you keep yourself from rushing. 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4. It's like 2, 5, 2, 5, and the 6, 8, 2, 5, 2. You only count the second and the fifth beat because they are the ones that give you the space on which you don't play, so that you don't rush it and become. In which case, it's really not a rubato by choice; it's a rubato by weakness. Now you should want to do rubato, and choosingly where, structurally, a delay of a cadence, then a pick up after, so that you have the feeling that you're telling the storytelling narratively, just like you talk to somebody about something, and so it becomes very spontaneous apparently, and you do. If he had written it in as accompaniment of Alberti. Willingly or not, that motoric left hand structures the pace of the right hand, but when you have chords on the second and third eighth notes and a bass to fetch and deeply drop, as if two hands play the bass note and the harmonies in the left hand itself, and then you have the melody. Have it harmonically unison, not unison, consonants, that's what I meant. And then with the dominant you have a dissonance because you have a tritone and you have the tension for the release of the tonal system. So who's to say that this diminished 70s shouldn't be a little bit tighter in rhythm so you can be relaxed on the downbeat, and then that little emotion, that little anxiety that the diminished 7 creates in us psychologically, even if we don't call it diminished 7th, we just call it tension perhaps, and then we release. And so it can be flux and reflux, and you can do it. And it was, oh my god, it's too much. Oh no, it's too straight, I need to do something. The problem is the something, right? How much of it and where? If you hesitate at the end of it and you delay before the next first beat, so it's slightly tipsy walking in the steps of the tempo, but at the same time it gives you the capacity of narrating the story with your own spontaneity. It doesn't mean that if you play Chopin, in this case, very strictly in tempo and avoiding willingly all rubati, that it will be less narrative. Of course, you can observe the echo cell, but differently. But it's too much different. Then I feel like the melodic line is chopped. Since all I had to do is go from the tonic to the relative major in some group of bars and beats. So if you conduct it, you will always give the upbeat to the orchestra to follow you, and you bring them to you so that they are constantly, continuously going on the track. If you beat only on the beats, then everybody will establish them so much that you end up by having heavy downbeats, possibly accented, and shortened weaker beats. Of course, it's a bit schematized. Obviously, it's not as flagrant when you hear it perform. But when you practice, if you can play it very emotionally, very musically, very legato, with the meaning of attention, release, and the hope and the interruption of eighth note rest, going to the relative major repeated notes and the last repeated note, being the blossom to return back to after F minor. So in that kind of narration, regardless of the tempo you take, the more you stretch the tempo artificially in this case, the more you don't see the arrival point as clearly as if you do. But then you see the arrival point, but in order to play in this tempo, you change the mood, the character. And you cannot go to that point fast. So the subdivision is for the detail, and the direction of the line is for the line, for the group. Micro. It's important not to do either or, but both. And I think the counting loud voice practicing, and then counting inner voice when you perform is a very good measure to organize the different pulse structures for each section, so that you can be in charge of where you go and choose to go a little rushed or a little slowed down, because you know how you're going to go back on the tracks. But if your tracks from the get-go are always following the hands, the fingers, the texture, then you're used to sort of swing around the difficulties. And when you have an arpeggio in the Beethoven Pathétique, it's hard to play these arpeggios when you held bar of chord. It's easy to shorten and then slow down when there's many notes. In fact, that's what the counting helps, is to organize all sections, busy or let's say emptier musically or with more rests, and organize the direction of the line and the detail. In Beethoven's 101 and the scherzo, it's tempting to overdot and overshorten, therefore, the short value. It sounds so much more heroic, but he wrote 16th note. And if in order to play the 16th note tight, you have to play faster the whole tempo in ratio, then musically it becomes perhaps to the point to which is neurotic or uncontrolled for the quality of the sound. Everything is just to rush to get there. And if you count in the under tempo, so you count on the rests, and Beethoven wrote some dots with the rhythm, meaning the note held, and some with the rest, but both are dotted rhythms. Nor 30 seconds grace notish, nor triplets loose. No. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3. So of course to count so fast is kind of funny. 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, just count the first pulse of each. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. You count with the beats. If you count off the beats, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4. Then you tell yourself the space between the beats and the off beats, which gives you that tension and release and organization of the spacing, that the rests are pregnant or regular or just driven, sometimes shortened. But they are part of the tension build and building, and then of course, note that follows is the release of it. And so you can choose a tempo in which you cannot count as fast, but then you count the beats for bars or bar a beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4. but your counting ping pongs with your playing. In a certain sense, you pull or push your playing according to the spaces that are between the beats, according to the texture, of course, of the music. All music don't play on the beat totally all the time. Some totally off, like in Schumann concerto, purposely displacing it, which creates a sense of constant unsettlement. And you have things that fit very well on the bar, as I said, especially Russian music when you do or and you can say I don't need to count because the melody and the harmony and the accompaniment, the arpeggios all fit on the beat beautifully. So I just want to focus on the melody. Count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and I sound mechanically playing it without that tension release of the arched phrase direction which the melodic arpeggio going up gives us. Then the secondary dominant of C minor before we return to the E flat major. Everything is part of the pulse. It's not just independently like you count something somehow just to keep it metronomically and then the music sings or harmonically is expressive of this or that feeling. I think it should be very expressive of all the feelings, harmonically, melodically, articulation-wise, whatever character you think the piece or section of piece is representing. And then the counting has to be made always self-counted in practicing so that you can have play in the box and think outside of the box. So for instance, Beethoven's Concerto Finale, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1. Of course, left hand plays on the beats, so you cannot miss the tempo. When the right hand starts off the beat, every 2 beats. Then the articulation is slurred so that you don't have to connect to the beat, but with an interruption that is not cut, but just re-articulated. And 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. And this kind of jumpy tense is like in the last movement of the C minor partita by Bach. Emphasize on this because this stretch staccato Bach and Beethoven about tense in a way gesturally, as I said earlier, makes us hold the tempo by the space that we do when we go between one and the other. Now, oops, that's the wrong note. Sorry for that. But if you hold it close to the keys and you just play exactly in front of the key before playing it by touching it, so the notation of between the 2 hands or the 1 hand or an adaptation, you can make an arrangement. Whichever way you think musically you express best the gestural leap. I still think that it's very important to always think as a conductor and play as an orchestra by fragmenting wind strings imaginarily, or of course sometimes in tutis, but it gives you the sense of not fragmented music, but puzzle of organized pieces. What holds the music puzzle is the pulse. And the pulse can evolve, it can have even rubato eventually, but generally it has to be a thread that connects the puzzle pieces and brings you to the arrival point, either by yourself when you're playing solo, to avoid you rushing, or to avoid you over slowing down because you're lost in space. All these beats are so long that I don't know where am I. And if by counting 2 to 3 4 3 to 3 4 4 to 3 4 1 to 3 4 2 to 3 4 3 to 3 4 2 to 3 4 1 to 3 4 2 to 3 4 3 to 3 4 4 to 3 4 1 to 3 4 2 to 3 4 3 to 3 4. I feel the space between the notes, but precisely. While musically I want to stretch the legato, which I would have practiced independently with hold and poke. Then rhythms, and then hold or overlap just for the beat, for the legato, but still count. 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. I think it's like the conductor subdividing with the right hand and with the left hand phrasing. So you phrase with your playing the legato, if it's legato in that section. The second theme of Chopin's concerto is just a pure marvel of aria. You don't need to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4. It kills the poetry of it, would you think? But if you count not, or you count on the beats, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. In the beginning, the melody is few notes, but when he decorates it and it becomes more driven, then you have some rubato in this patterns of decoration, and it's very, very impressive. Drive, and then you go back to tempo 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, then 4 bars of forward 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, and then in tempo 1 and 2, 3 and 3 and 4, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. As soon as you have moving notes, you don't count as much because the fingers count for you by playing a lot of notes. But then there are lesser notes. You have to count more subdivisions mentally without to chop the melodic line in order to re-establish such connection between the macro and the micro, the detail and the whole. Project yourself while organize your steps. It's a very important thing, because if you don't conduct yourself, then you don't tell the storytelling. You sort of become hostage of your fingers, of your technique, of your arms being stiff or not, according to how difficult section is, to withhold, to bring to the next level. And when you have a beginning like repeated notes, and take Waldstein slower, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. You still have to count 3, 4, 1, 2, and giving yourself an upbeat 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or remember the original tempo of the theme of 109's last movement. So when you have the different meters, 2, 4, 2, 6, to 9, 8, 2, 3, 1, 2. As he says, slightly slower than the beginning. But by that time you might have forgotten the beginning. Or in the Fantasiestück, he says, aus erst bewegt, which means on the get-go driven, at least in one of the translations I can come up with. And a syncopated bass note, and the right hand having the pattern rhythmically, motorically. And many times you hear people start under and then build up the excitement. I call that steam engine style. But regardless, perhaps it's aesthetically defendable. I don't. But if he said erst aus erst in the education, out from the get-go fast, you feel the anxiety of the syncopation of the left hand over the right hand, and you feel like you're taken in some kind of non-stop vortex, and like, how will I get out of it? And if you try to count only with your hands, 1, 2, on the beats, you square it down. If you count in a syncopation, 2, 1, 2, 3, 2, you feel with the anticipation and the build-up, or the anticipation and the catch-up of the two hands, which direction you start from. But obviously they don't align, and purposely so, until the downbeat, and then 1 and 2 and 2. Generally, music doesn't follow the patterns of the count, but the count adapts to the patterns of the structure. A conductor doesn't play, therefore only deals with the pulse. You have to deal with the pulse while playing, and that is why I advocate so much, besides and after the metronome practice, delegating to a mechanical conductor to become your own conductor, so that you can always have the sense of spaces between the rest, the notes, the syncopations, the hemiolas, the downbeats, the accents, the articulations. All these things are never exactly in the same organizational pattern, but you can always then organize your path through the piece which you serve. Thank you.